Hello and welcome to the third chapter in our Decision Services training. This chapter is entitled Contract Creation, and it's all about a process which is a fundamental part of building a decision service, and indeed is going to be the first thing that happens in the majority of decision services. Let's take a look at the agenda. We'll begin by discussing what exactly a contract is and why we need to start with a contract. Then we'll look at how we define elements for input and output and how we modify and delete them, and then how we can distinguish between object-level elements and top-level elements. Finally, we'll discuss ways to visualize a contract. Now, because this training course is targeting people who are familiar with Oracle policy modeling, I have deliberately used the word attribute, contract attributes, because I know that most people will immediately understand when I talk about an attribute that I'm talking about a data element. I should not really use the word attribute, since the word attribute does not occur in the vocabulary of decision services. They are referred to as fields. So gradually, over the next few chapters, you'll hear me use attribute less and less and field more and more. Let's begin at the beginning. What is a contract? Well, the simple way to look at it is this. If you're using Oracle Policy Modeling and you need your project to be connected to an external integration platform or another application, the developer, depending on what application it is and the particular context, is given the job of adding technical names, mapped in names, and mapped out names to attributes in the project. So in a sense, the mapped in items represent what we can call the input contract. It's the data that OIA expects and needs to receive, and the mapped out items represent the output contract that the external application expects to receive. So that's precisely what a contract is, a definition of input and output elements. In a decision service, you will always need to create input and output mappings. Obviously, if you're going to have input contract mappings, you are saying that you wish to feed data into the decision service. Perhaps because you are going to call it as a web service, or because you are going to reference it in Oracle Policy Modeling and pass data from Oracle Policy Modeling to a decision service, more of which we'll talk about later. Output contract, these are the mandatory fields that you want to expose to the outside world. If you are going to have your decision service consumed by another application, the other application expects to receive answers. It is always best, therefore, to begin your decision service work by creating the contract items, because they define the technical inputs and outputs of your service. They will be defined by someone who is not necessarily the rule designer, which is why you'll recall from an earlier chapter that it requires a different role to be able to create contracts. You need to be manager role. To create a contract is really quite simple. Inside the decision service main window, we need to define either input or output elements. I still use the word attribute here, but they are called input or output fields. I'll need to define two elements: the natural text that represents the field and a technical name that represents the field. Plus, I'll need to define the data type and whether it is required if it's an input item. Just like Oracle Policy Modeling to a certain extent, I could also simply create a rule and then use copy and paste to help me create the input or output item. But let's be honest, creating the contract items before you write rules encourages the visualization of the objective of the decision service. What do we want to achieve? What data do we have coming in and what data do we have coming out? Defining this up front will make it much easier to agree on the specifications, technical specifications of your decision service. So here's a detailed screenshot that walks through the steps. On the left-hand side of the decision service window, you can see output and input, two separate clickable tabs. I've clicked the input tab, and I can then click the plus button to create one or more input fields. I can choose the type. Then in the second half of the screenshot, I enter in zone 3 the technical name for my input field, followed by the text that represents the input field in zone 4. I can specify whether it is required or not using the switch, marked number 5. And if I need to, I can click the Done button to say I'm finished, or I can click the ellipsis and choose Delete if I am deciding to delete an existing attribute. In the screenshot, you'll notice that the second attribute is underlined in red, and there is an error in the rule. Since the second input has not yet been declared as an input field, the decision service doesn't know what to do with it. So the decision service flags that basically this is an unknown piece of information. As soon as I create a second input field with the second input, the underlining and the error would disappear. Creating an output attribute, or we should say an output field, is pretty much the same. Choose the correct type, enter the technical name, copy and paste perhaps the natural text. Again, if you need to, you can delete it. We spoke briefly about objects, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to objects later on in this course. We said they were a concept similar to entities to allow for the storage of multiple instances. So, if you have input or output elements that are based on an object, then you need to make sure that your contract reflects this. So you can select and create a contract item of type object. Once you've done that, you'll notice in the first screenshot on the left-hand side, there is a small triangle next to the person, the object I created in the previous slide. And I can now create fields such as the person's date of birth, which belong to this object. So the person's date of birth is a field of the person. Notice the second screenshot. If while you're working you accidentally create an input or output element in the wrong place, for example, you create a field in the person that is not inside the person but inside another object, or indeed not inside an object at all, you can click the traffic light menu and you will be offered one or more move to choices to move your field from one object to another, or from the object out of the object into the top level. So in this final screenshot, you can notice that I have in my outputs created a person's object with a single field called the person's age. So my output contract must also respect the structure of whatever it is I'm sending back to the calling application. So I intend to send back one or more persons in output and each person will have an age. To finish, you may be asking yourself, aside from decision service editing, is there another way to view the contract? The short answer is yes. You could use the Actions menu in the decision service window to export the decision service. It is in JSON format, so you could then simply use Notepad++, for example, or any other JSON viewer to study the contract items. You can also use the Actions menu and the Run via REST option. This will present you with a series of links, and if you are interested in understanding the contract definition, then you will be interested in the Swagger specification file, which you can download by clicking on the link, or you can copy the URL by clicking the button. If you have access to that URL or that file, then you could use a platform such as Swagger Hub or Swagger UI to load the Swagger definition file into the console, which would then allow you to easily review the definition of your decision service contract. This can be extremely useful when you are studying a decision service created by someone else and you are interested as to what are the input and output elements. As you can see in the screenshot, I have an input composed of a current date, a first input and a second input, that's a string and two numbers, and a person, which is an array, so a number of instances. Similarly, the output has a Boolean and a number and persons, which represent the output data, a number of person instances. While we're on the concept of contracts, having these Swagger definitions makes it much easier to integrate decision services into other applications that use modern frameworks. And companies or organizations that use Swagger to manage hundreds of APIs will be able to simply add the decision service to their collection of APIs. We spoke a moment ago about how the Run with REST option allows us to access these URLs. Access to the Swagger specification, so the third link in this screenshot, is behind an authentication. So if you're going to do a live pull down of the swagger.json file, you will need first to acquire a bearer token. So it is useful to be able to find the URL to obtain a bearer token, which is the second link in this screenshot, the one that has a red box around it. So what do we need to finish on? Well, we need to summarize that a new working principle is starting to take shape. When you build a decision service, you should, normally at least, begin by developing and outlining the input fields and the output fields before writing any rules. This is good practice because it allows us to understand the specification, what the other application is expecting to receive or what we are expecting to receive. It also helps focus the mind on what are the data types and how will the data be exchanged. In this chapter, we also looked at how to define fields, how to modify fields, delete fields, and how to handle the fact that fields may exist at top level or may exist inside an object, so you can move them around. And finally, we just finished on how to view a contract outside of the decision service. As promised, this is probably the last time you'll hear me use the word attribute, because from now on, whenever we're talking about a decision service, we should talk about input fields and output fields and object fields. Coming up, we have a demonstration of all of the concepts which we've just gone through before we move on to the next chapter. See you shortly. So in this demo to accompany the third chapter, we're going to focus on the concept of contracts, specifically how to create input and output contract items. As we discussed in the presentation, creating input and output contract items is the fundamental element of a decision service. A decision service has to be consumed by something or somebody else. And in order to be consumed properly, we need to define what's coming in and what's coming out. So unlike working with Oracle policy modeling, where mapping and inputs and outputs was always kind of relegated to projects that had connections or had some form of integration, with decision services, it's simply a fact of life. You're going to have to do it every time. So let's go into the Intelligence Advisor Hub, and I'll go ahead and create a new project. And I'll call this the demonstration of contracts. So as usual, when we create a new decision service, we get one rule block and one rule created for us. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove that text and replace it with something simple, such as the customer is always right if the customer has paid the bill. Very puerile and very simple, but hey, bear with me. So we already know in this case we have an input, which is the customer has paid the bill, and we have ostensibly something that we want to output. The customer is always right. So as a starting point, we will need to go to the Input tab, and I'm going to copy and paste this to save a bit of time. I'm going to create a new record, and it's going to be of type Boolean, and I'm going to paste in the text, and the first part is where I can give it a technical name, so I'm going to call this cust_paid. It is or isn't required. I'll leave it as required, and I'll click Done. So now I have a required attribute. So, and of course, as I discussed in the presentation, I should really call them fields, since that's what we're now calling them in the documentation. So I have a required field called the customer has paid the bill, and it will be identified as CUST_PAID. We'll see how that works in just a moment. And then we will use the output to be the Boolean called, we'll call it cust right, and click Done. So now that I have an input attribute and an output attribute, I can go ahead, of course, and test it in live mode. And in the inputs, I will say that the customer has paid the bill, which means, therefore, that the customer is always right is set to true. I'll switch back to editing mode, and I will commit this to create version 1. And I will use the Run as REST feature, which we introduced in the previous demo, which allows me to test a decision service in a much more external application-focused way. So in the Try It section, I will be able to use my input to get my output. You'll notice that the technical names, CUST_right and CUST_paid, are those which I defined in the output and in the input. So when you're creating attributes, remember that the first part is the technical part and the second part is the natural language part. So we can perform another example right here. We can say something like the total equals the first attribute multiplied by the second attribute, and show you once again. So it will be an input, in this case of type number, and an input again of type number, and if we want to expose the total as something in outputs, I will need to remember to go to output, create it as a number. So I can now switch to live mode, go to my inputs, let's say 12 times 12, 144, Excellent. I'll commit this to create version 2 before switching over to run via REST. I'll test the cust paid, but because these two are required, I will enter my first item and my second item, and I will get my total and my output for my first rule. What is interesting, and you should take note, is that because the first attribute and the second attribute are required, but the customer paid was not required, the output of the service is not available until I have provided, at the very least, the two required items. Let's return to my decision service, and let's just talk about the other feature that we mentioned. I'm going to split this into a second rule block. And we spoke about the concept briefly of objects, which you'll be studying in an upcoming chapter in much more detail. Objects, we said, are similar to entities, but not quite the same. So I'm going to go and create a new rule block, and then I will add an object, and we'll call this the products. And we won't have any kind of condition, and we'll call this the product name and the product price. So you'll see I have two errors, and it says the product name and the product price has an ambiguous type because it has no clear idea of what it is. So this is another example of where you really need to get into the habit of creating contract items before you do anything else, because obviously if you create the items, so I'll go ahead and create an object, and we'll call it products, and it gets value from the products. Now you'll see I have this little drop down so that when I create a second element, in this case I'm going to call this a string, and this is going to be the product name. Oops. I'll edit that, make sure I fix that spelling mistake. And the product price. And now I'll put in some values. So I'll say this is product 1, and this will be 120 currency units. You'll see I still have an issue because I've actually got a spelling mistake in here. So I'm going to go in here and add the extra element. There we go. So now I have an object with two elements to it, the product name and the product price, specified as output. If I now go to my live, because there's no criteria here, you'll see that I create one record. It's called product 1, and it has 120. So you can think of this as a little bit like inferring an instance of an entity. And when I go to the edit, and I'll commit that. You don't have to commit this when you're doing this, but I'm just going through the motions for the sake of clarity. I'll go to run as REST again. So now I check my box, enter my values, and you can see I have my two fields here, and I have my products, well, specifically one product that has been presented as output. If I go back and let's add a second row, we'll call this product 2. Sorry, it's not very original, I know. And we'll call this 140. I'll commit it, I'll run as REST. So once again, add in my two values that are required, and you'll see now that I have the customer is not right because the customer hasn't paid, the total is 144, and I have my two products, product 1 and product 2. So basically what hopefully this is also demonstrating to you is that a decision service is a discrete unit. So in this set of rules, even though logically you could say to me, Richard, the first attribute and the second attribute have nothing to do with the customer is always right, and they have nothing to do with these products, because in the input these two are required. This one is also required, but of course it's a checkbox, so it's not a case of it's always going to have a value of true or false. Whereas here we have the first and second attributes that if they're null, when we go to run as rest, it considers that the input data is invalid because it needs one of these. It needs both of these. I'm sorry. So even though we think of these as being logically separated in some way, they're all part of the same service. So think carefully about when you're building a service, what it actually represents. It could be that in my case, these two elements at the top here would be better described in two separate services because the customer is always right. I'm not getting an answer for that unless I provide the first and second attribute. So there's an example of where perhaps creating two separate services would be better than having one. But I want to focus on one specific thing, is that if you're going to create a contract, do it at the beginning, before you've created any rules. It forces you to think about how your service will be consumed, and it of course forces you to think about how what is the objective of the service. So if I'd gone through that process, I probably wouldn't be in the situation I am today, where I have one outcome which is failing to show up because I've set these up as required attributes. So you have to think carefully about what the service is going to provide. For completeness sake, if you've built attributes, you can, of course, go back into them and edit them. And if you click down here, you can also delete them. So if you wish to remove an input element. And here's another important one, is if I'm looking at an object and I'm looking at an object attribute, an object field like the product price, down here, you'll notice I have an option that says move. Move it, in my case, to the top, because there's only one other place it could go. So I've moved product price out of the object into the top level. Of course, I'm getting an error now because it says that doesn't make much sense. And I'll now move this back again, move to products, and everything will go right again. So you're able to move fields around between objects. Notice the terminology as well, the move to top. We don't talk about global anymore, we just talk about move to top, which means the top level. Well, I hope that little demonstration has helped you understand how to build a contract, and also importantly, the role and the reason behind having a contract. And I look forward to see you in the next chapter.